Margaret sat by the window as the last light of autumn slipped behind the Vermont hills. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her feel every year of her 68. The leaves outside scattered with the wind, brushing across the porch like tiny messengers of time. She pulled her shawl tighter, not only against the chill, but against the ache that sometimes rose in her chest when evenings stretched too long. Her life had been steady, marked by the kind of love that left deep roots. Her husband, Robert, had passed away years ago, but the memory of his laughter, the strength of his hand in hers, still lived inside her. She thought of him often in these quiet moments, as though he might walk in at any second with his easy smile. But now it was only her, the walls, and the sound of the ticking clock. Daniel, her grandson, had moved in recently. At 24, he was chasing a graduate degree in Boston. But the long commute and the noise of the city often brought him back here, where he found peace, and Margaret found company she didn't know she needed. He was thoughtful in ways that surprised her, a young man with an old soul, who always seemed to sense when she needed someone to break the silence. That night, as the air turned colder, Daniel appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. He had that habit of making her feel seen, as though he carried her comfort in mind without being asked. "I thought you might like something warm," he said, handing her the cup. She took it with a smile, feeling the steam rise against her face. He sat down beside her, close enough that she felt his presence, steady and calm. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just watched the branches outside bend with the wind. Margaret often found peace in these silences with him, but tonight felt different. She noticed how he kept shifting slightly, his eyes lowered to the tea, his fingers tightening around the mug. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Grandma," he said softly, his tone steady but carrying something heavier than usual. "Can I tell you something that's been on my mind?" Margaret turned to him, surprised. His voice was not the light-hearted one he used when sharing stories from class or joking about life in the city. This was deeper, the kind of tone that carried secrets. She leaned back, searching his face. There was a seriousness there that pulled at her heart. "Of course, Daniel," she said gently. "You can always tell me anything." He nodded, almost to himself, as if confirming it was safe to continue. Margaret noticed the way his chest rose and fell a little quicker, the way his eyes seemed both afraid and determined. Something in her heart told her this was not going to be a small confession. The room felt smaller now, wrapped in stillness. The clock ticked louder, the tea cooled in her hands, and the air between them seemed to hum with anticipation. She wanted to ask what was troubling him, but she held her tongue. She knew enough about life to let someone speak in their own time. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. And for a moment Margaret was struck by how much of Robert she saw in him, the same sharp jawline, the same depth in his gaze. But there was also a vulnerability there that Robert had never shown so openly. "Grandma," he said again, softer this time, "I don't know how you'll take this, but I need you to hear me." Her heart gave a small jolt. She had no idea what words were about to come, but instinct told her they would matter more than anything he had ever said before. The night outside pressed against the glass, the wind sighed through the trees. And Margaret sat frozen in that moment, waiting for the words that would soon change the way she saw her grandson forever. Daniel sat with his tea, his fingers tightening around the mug as though it was the only thing keeping him steady. Margaret could feel the weight in his silence, the pause before words that mattered. She stayed calm, her eyes gentle, waiting for him to find the courage to speak. "Grandma," he began, his voice low but steady, "you've always been the strongest person in my life. I don't just mean family strong, I mean something more. You've been my guide, my anchor, the one I could count on no matter what." Margaret's lips curved in a faint smile, touched by the sincerity in his tone, but she also felt a flicker of doubt. She had never thought of herself that way. In her mind, she was simply a woman who did what needed to be done, who loved and lost and carried on because there was no other choice. "You give me too much credit, Daniel," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. He shook his head quickly, his eyes bright, his expression almost urgent. "No, Grandma. I mean it. You've faced so much, and yet you've never stopped carrying love with you. That's something rare. I watch you and I realize it's more than strength. It's love that doesn't fade even after years. You still carry Grandpa with you, don't you?" The words caught her off guard. She blinked, the sting of memory sharp in her chest. Robert's name hadn't been spoken in the room for weeks, maybe months. But hearing it now was like a gentle ache opening again. She nodded slowly, unable to deny it. "Yes, I do. Some loves never leave you." Daniel leaned forward, his voice hushed but urgent. "That's what I'm afraid of. I look at the way you've loved him all these years, even after he's gone, and I wonder, will I ever be able to love someone like that? Will I ever find someone who means that much to me?" His words poured out, not rehearsed, but raw, and Margaret's heart tightened. She saw it clearly. Now this wasn't just admiration. It was longing. A fear that gnawed at him. The same fear she remembered having when she was young. Before Robert came into her life, she reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his arm in comfort. "You're still young, Daniel. Love doesn't always arrive when you expect it. Sometimes it comes when you're not even looking." But he shook his head, a shadow crossing his face. "I've met people, Grandma. I've dated, I've tried. But no one feels real. I compare every girl I meet to something I can't even explain. And the truth is, I think I compare them to you." Margaret froze, her breath catching. She stared at him, uncertain if she had heard correctly. Her mind raced, searching for the meaning behind his words. Daniel lowered his eyes, ashamed yet determined to speak his truth. "I don't mean it the wrong way. It's not about, attraction. It's about what you represent. When I think about the kind of partner I want, I think about loyalty, kindness, strength, the way you've lived your life. And I can't seem to find anyone who even comes close to that." The words sank deep into her. For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. She had expected him to confess about stress at school, fears about the future, maybe a girl he liked. But this was different. This was a young man searching for meaning in love. And he was holding her as the example. She finally exhaled, her hand still resting on his arm. "Daniel, you see me through the eyes of someone who's watched me all your life. But you must understand love looks different when you're living it. It's not perfect. Your grandfather and I had our struggles. We fought, we forgave, we built something through years of patience. What you see now is the result of all that, not the beginning." Daniel looked up, his eyes wet but steady. "But that's just it. That's what I want. Real love, the kind that doesn't disappear when things get hard. I don't care about perfect. I just want something that lasts." Margaret's heart ached. She wanted to tell him he would find it, that one day he'd meet someone who lit up his world the way Robert once lit hers. But looking at him now, so young yet carrying the weight of disappointment already, she felt both pride and sorrow. Pride, because he was searching for something real. Sorrow, because life had a way of making that search long and painful. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Daniel, love doesn't come as a mirror of someone else. It comes as something new, unexpected, sometimes even confusing. You won't find another me, but you will find someone who will bring out the best in you, just as Robert did for me." Daniel nodded faintly, but Margaret could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. His confession wasn't about giving up. It was about fearing he might never find what he longed for. And she, sitting there with her own memories wrapped around her heart, knew exactly what he meant. The night pressed on around them. And though the room was still, Margaret felt as though something had shifted. Daniel had opened a door inside himself, showing her not just admiration, but a deep, unspoken ache. And she knew this conversation was only the beginning of what he truly needed to say. The room grew heavy with silence after Daniel's words. Margaret sat still, her heart unsettled. She had listened to many things in her life, joys, regrets, and truth spoken late at night, but something about this moment felt different. Daniel wasn't just speaking as her grandson. He was speaking as a young man desperate to put his feelings into words, even if they risked being misunderstood. Daniel placed his mug on the small table beside him. His hands were trembling slightly, and his eyes kept darting between the floor and his grandmother's face. Margaret wanted to ease his nerves, but she sensed interrupting him now would only close him off. So she waited, her palms resting quietly on her lap, her heart beating faster than she expected. "Grandma," Daniel said finally, his voice almost a whisper, "there's more I need to tell you." Margaret leaned closer, her chest tightening. "Go on, dear." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I've been carrying something inside for a long time. I never told anyone because I didn't think they would understand. But I trust you. I've always trusted you." The confession came slowly, like a door being opened inch by inch. Margaret's breath caught as she watched him struggle. She knew the words he was searching for would change their relationship in some way, whether large or small. "I don't just admire your strength," Daniel said, his tone sharper now, urgent. "I see beauty in yous. Still, I see the way you live, the way you love, and it feels different. It makes me think about what real love should be. When I imagine the kind of partner I want, I can't help but compare them to you." Margaret froze, stunned. She had expected perhaps a secret about school or fears about his future. But not this. Not words that made her chest feel both heavy and fragile at once. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Daniel pressed on, his eyes burning with honesty. "I don't mean this in the wrong way. It's not about attraction, it's about something deeper. I look at you, Grandma, and I see love that doesn't fade, even after Grandpa. I see loyalty that never breaks. I see a kind of grace I've never found in anyone else. And it scares me, because I'm afraid I'll never find someone like that." Margaret's hand trembled against her shawl. She searched his face, looking for the boy she once cradled, the teenager who used to laugh in the backyard. But what she saw now was a man grown, hurting, searching for answers he couldn't find in his own world. She finally whispered, "Daniel, you're comparing what you see now to what you think love is. But you're seeing the end result, not the beginning. Your grandfather and I grew into this. It wasn't perfect at first. It was years of learning, forgiving, holding on." But Daniel shook his head, his expression raw. "I know. But even with all of that, you stayed. You kept loving him. That's what I can't get out of my head. I meet people my age and they give up so easily. They walk away at the first sign of trouble. I don't want that. I want something lasting. And you're the only example I have." His words struck deep. Margaret felt her throat tighten, tears threatening. She had lived long enough to know how rare that kind of longing was in the young. Most people his age weren't thinking about lasting love. They were chasing fleeting moments. But here he was, her grandson, bearing his soul with a confession that left her speechless. The clock ticked on, loud in the quiet room. Margaret clasped her hands together to steady herself. She wanted to reassure him, to protect him from the ache she saw in his eyes. But she also knew the truth had to be spoken gently. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling with both love and gravity, "what you feel right now is not just about me. It's about what you're searching for in your own life. You see me as the measure of love because you've watched me closely. But this isn't where your heart belongs. Your heart is meant to find its own path, its own person." Daniel's jaw tightened, and his eyes shone with a mix of fear and hope. "But what if I never find them? What if no one lives up to that?" Margaret's breath shook as she reached out and covered his hand with hers. His skin was warm, trembling slightly beneath her touch. She looked into his eyes, and in that moment, she saw the boy and the man, both longing for answers. "You will?" she whispered. "Because now you know what love is supposed to look like. And knowing that is the first step. You won't settle for less. And that's why one day, when you least expect it, someone will surprise you. They'll leave you speechless, just as you've left me tonight." The words lingered between them, heavy but tender. Daniel exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for hours. His shoulders slumped, a quiet relief mixed with lingering doubt. But Margaret could see he had needed to confess, to pour out the fear that weighed on him. The night outside deepened, the wind brushing softly against the windows. The tea had long gone cold, but neither of them noticed. What mattered was the truth that had been spoken, raw and unguarded. Margaret sat back slowly, her chest still trembling. She had lived many nights filled with memories, but this moment with Daniel was unlike anything she had ever known. It wasn't about romance, nor was it about longing in the way stories often told. It was about the kind of love that bridges generations, the kind of honesty that leaves two hearts changed forever. And though she couldn't yet grasp what tomorrow would bring, she knew this night, the night her grandson confessed the depths of his heart, would stay with her always. Margaret sat frozen for a moment after Daniel's words. The air in the room felt thick, carrying the weight of everything he had just confessed. She had not expected such honesty, and for a few heartbeats she could only stare at him, her mind catching up to the truth he had revealed. Daniel's eyes held no shame, only vulnerability, as if he had finally unburdened himself of something he had carried too long. Slowly, she let out a breath, her hands trembling slightly. She placed her teacup aside and reached for his hand, holding it with the quiet strength that had always been her way. "Daniel," she said gently, "you've given me words I never thought I'd hear. You've opened your heart, and I want you to know I will never forget that." He looked at her, waiting, desperate for her response. Margaret could see the fear behind his eyes, the fear that she might misunderstand, that she might turn away. But she did not. She only tightened her hold on his hand, grounding him in the moment. "What you feel," she continued, "isn't wrong. It's love, yes, but it's also searching. You see in me the reflection of what you want in life. You see loyalty, devotion, and love that lasts, and you're afraid you won't find it. But, Daniel, you will. Your heart is young, your journey's still ahead. One day, someone will walk into your life and show you the same kind of love you admire in me. You just have to be patient enough to let it happen." Daniel's throat tightened, his voice barely steady. "But what if I never do? What if the world doesn't make people like that anymore?" Margaret's eyes glistened as she shook her head softly. "Love has always been there, even when the world feels uncertain. Your grandfather wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But we chose each other every day, even through hardship. That's what makes love last. It isn't about finding someone flawless. It's about finding someone who will stay." Her words sank deep into him, and for the first time that night, Daniel allowed a faint smile to flicker across his face. He wasn't completely reassured, but he felt lighter, as though her wisdom had eased a part of the storm inside him. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. The night outside was dark and quiet, but within those walls there was a warmth neither of them would forget. Margaret released his hand and leaned back slightly, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "Do you know what you've given me tonight?" she asked. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You've reminded me that even at my age, I can still touch someone's heart. Sometimes when you grow older, you start to believe your best years are behind you, that no one looks at you the same way anymore. But tonight, you reminded me that love, in all its forms, doesn't fade. It keeps living, through memories, through family, and through moments like this." Daniel's eyes softened. "Grandma, you'll always matter. She'll always be the example I look up to." Her chest swelled with emotion, and for a brief second she felt Robert's presence, as if he were standing in the room, proud of the family they had built. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of that thought wrap around her. When she opened them, she saw Daniel looking at her not just as a grandson, but as someone who had found comfort in her strength. His confession had been brave, raw, and it had tied them even closer than before. "Promise me something," Margaret said at last, her tone firm but tender. "Anything," Daniel replied quickly. "Promise me that you won't give up on love, that you won't let fear stop you from opening your heart. 'Cause if you do, you'll miss the moment when the right person finally arrives." Daniel nodded, his voice steady. "I promise." The promise hung in the air like a quiet vow, binding them both in that moment. As the night drew on, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't felt in years. She realized that love didn't just belong to the young, or to memories of the past that could live in conversations, in shared truths, in the simple act of being present for one another. When Daniel finally rose to go to his room, he paused at the doorway, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "Thank you for listening, Grandma. Thank you for understanding." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Thank you for trusting me with your heart." He gave a small nod, then disappeared down the hallway, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. She turned back to the window, watching the branches sway in the wind, her heart both heavy and full. That night, she didn't feel the usual emptiness that came with silence. Instead, she felt surrounded by something greater, by love that stretched across generations, by the memory of her husband and by the honesty of her grandson. She knew she would never forget the words spoken that evening. They were not ordinary words. They were words that revealed a soul, that bridged the gap between age and youth, between past and future. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, whispering softly into the quiet, "Some moments stay forever." And she knew this was one of them. Night her grandson's confession left her speechless. The night that reminded her love always finds a way to live on,